We're talking chapter 18, the effect that infrastructure had on the country, specifically the effect that it had on innovations. And we're going to focus on these 5 innovations. There's many more, but these are the 5 that we're going to focus on. The first is factories and venture capital. So Samuel Slater was born in England, and he worked as an apprentice in a textile factory in England. Now, in this time period, in the late 1700s, England had much more advanced technologies, and they had a much better design for the textile factory than the United States did. But when he immigrated over to the United States, he had in his mind this idea of how to develop the textile factory, the Power Loom especially. But he didn't have the ability to develop this because he didn't have money. He didn't have access to capital. That came in Almy and Brown. Almy and Brown had already tried to set up their own textile mills, but were never successful in terms of matching the technology that was found in England. So they had a lot of money and a desire to develop this company. And Slater had the know-how, the knowledge, but no money. And so when we talk about venture capital, it's the connection of these 2 types of individuals. Those that have money, that want to invest it and get a return on their investment and into a specific company, and then a startup company, and then Slater, who had the industrial know-how. And so because of this combination, that's an example of venture capital, and it's what is led to Samuel Slater being known as the father of the Industrial Revolution. And so he invented the Power Loom, built off and designed stolen technology from England, but the Power Loom became incredibly prevalent, and it really made the United States a textile leader in terms of the cotton production in the South, and then being able to use that cotton to produce cloth. The second example is cotton gins and patents. So the cotton gin separates the seeds from the fibers. And so the fibers are what's used to create cotton for the clothes. And so here's an example of a hand cranked. There's a large one, which is horsepower, water powered. But what this allowed you to be able to produce and grow more cotton and be able to separate it and to be able to send it to a textile mill. And so Eli Whitney was granted the patent on this, which meant that he was the sole owner of this process. And so others could use it, but they had to pay him for it. As a result, we saw a huge increase in the number of bales of cotton that was produced between 1830 and 1850, as well as a very large increase in the number of slaves. Now, it was illegal to import more slaves, but a lot of the slaves happened because of improved health outcomes. So specifically, infant health. Infants were living longer and individuals living longer because they were at least given more health to try to keep them alive longer and improve their health so they could work in the fields. The third is, I guess the other thing to mention with the patents is by that patent, it grants a specific individual the specific property rights for 20 years. And so that's very valuable because that individual then has a monopoly for those 20 years. After those 20 years, it's open access and anyone can access those technologies. The third is interchangeable parts. And so what interchangeable parts looks at is one really good example, I think, of this is the firearms business. So the arms race can be a very good business, selling arms to military. Just think of Tony Stark. And so at this time period, the U.S. military was one of the major consumers of these firearms. So John Hancock Hall invented a breech-loading rifle based on interchangeable parts, meaning that rather than develop each part by hand, machines could develop these parts. And the thing that we see with Hall is that his Hall rifles not only could fire significantly more rounds, but they could hit the target at a higher percentage. And so these became superior rifles. And as a result, became much better at killing people. And unfortunately, he developed this right before the Civil War. But this is just an example of these interchangeable parts because what it allows you to do is to build very large factories and take advantage of economies of scale, producing large amounts of the good to reduce the average cost per unit. And there's many different examples of interchangeable parts, but this really built upon these ideas of Adam Smith, of not just people specializing, but actually factories specializing in the division of labor and the division of production. It led to assembly lines, and it also led to what we call a continuous process production, which means like you actually don't need people there. The machines would run the whole process for you. It also then developed what we call skilled and unskilled labor. And that is skilled people who have this knowledge of specific things. So a skilled labor might be the one who physically knows how to dig out the barrel of a gun, where unskilled labor is just the person who knows which buttons to push on the machine so it barrels out for the gun. And so these are some different impacts that happen as a result of interchangeable parts. The fourth is the labor market. The labor market changed dramatically because people could move. Specifically with these advent of larger factories in big cities, a lot of immigrants began to move. And so Samuel Slater, yep, that guy, he established what he called the Rhode Island system. And he was trying to replicate these New England communities. And so he'd build these factories around these towns, and then the factory owners would build everything around the town, from housing, company stores, to even Sunday school. And they would try to recruit both men, women, and children to come work in these factories as a way to try to increase the amount of labor in these factories. And so you have now, when women start going to work in these factories, children start going to work in these factories, and a large increase of immigrants. As a result, we can look at principles of microeconomics. So here's the demand of labor. Here's what factories want to hire. When wages are really high, factories will hire very few workers. As wages go low, factories will hire a lot of workers. And so this is the demand. The supply of labor is dealing with individuals. When wages are high, people want to work more. When wages are low, people want to work less. And there's some equilibrium here that at certain wages, you can hire as many workers as the factories need. And there's the equilibrium. But when you have an increase in supply because you have more workers, you have more women working, more children working, more immigrants working, it shifts that supply curve out. And it has the resulting effect that wages actually go down and labor goes up, and the quantity of labor goes up, the number of workers goes up. And that's exactly what's happening in these industrial towns where you had the Rhode Island system, is you'd have everybody in the family working to try to increase labor, but it caused the wages to go down. And the fifth thing is the power and energy. Is some of the innovations that allowed to increase energy. So here is just focusing on one of these that I find interesting, is the water wheel. So you have here the undershot water wheel. So it's designed just to place this on top of flowing water, on top of a river, and the river is going to push that water wheel, it's going to turn, and it's going to then create energy. Well, they said, well, water flow will do that, but so will gravity. So what if we have this overshot water wheel? Well, in order to do this, you need some type of natural head, or you need some natural elevation changer to build that yourself. And so it became it's harder to do, harder to build, but it creates a lot more energy. Well, here you have the upper penstock. You could also do just the normal penstock, which has a much lower head. And again, it's relying on gravity and the flow of the river to push this wheel and create lots of energy. And so by creating this energy, you're able to really do a lot more in terms of industrialization. Is the water energy could really do a lot to power factories and begin to power factories because we didn't have electricity at this time. And so just this innovation of water and the impact of the water wheel was able to really increase the type of factories that were run at this time. And so those are 5 examples of innovations that were made possible because of infrastructure. Again, one of the biggest reasons that infrastructure was such a big impact is it was able to connect markets. It was able to connect a lot of producers to a lot more consumers. And that's what drove these innovations.